Hi guys, this is Genetics Part 2 of Chapter 14, and so I'm going to open up my PowerPoint and we're going to get started. At this point you should be reading Chapter 14, following along. I'm following pretty carefully along with the chapter, so you should also be thinking about problem solving. I will be posting an online assignment for you to complete that is going to involve Chapter 14 and Chapter 15 material. I'll be posting that pretty quickly as I can. This is a kind of a rush that's going on, that's for sure. But let me get started. Let's look at where we are. So, Mendel and the Gene Idea, Part 2. We've introduced this chapter and looked at Mendel's contribution to the study of inheritance. Think we introduced terminology and Punnett squares and monohybrid and dihybrid crosses. Now we want to start solving genetics problems, and we're going to do Roman numeral 3 here in this mini lecture, and we'll start solving genetics problems using the rules of probability. We can solve genetics problems with Punnett squares, but sometimes they become really big and hard to deal with and just clumsy. I don't like Punnett squares because I make lots of errors when I solve genetics problems, so I'd rather use the rules of probability. So that's what we're going to teach you how to do, and we'll go through a few problems. Remember, when we do these problems, it might be smart to pause the video and try to solve them on your own before just getting the solution, so that you have given it a good try. So instead of using Punnett squares, we can use the rules of probability to help us solve genetics problems. There's 2 rules we're going to teach you, and you already know them. It's just remembering what they are. The first rule is called the rule of multiplication, and here's our definition. It's kind of messy, but here it is. The probability of 2 independent events occurring in combination, occurring together or at the same time, is equal to the product of their separate probabilities. Product meaning multiplying, right? So it's called the AND rule. The probability of this happening and that happening is equal to the multiplication or the product of their separate probabilities. Let me give you an example with dice. These are my examples. Suppose you're playing Yahtzee and you are you're on the last roll and you're trying to get a Yahtzee, and you have 3 sixes and you need to roll 2 sixes with this pair of dice. You need to roll a 6 on this die and a 6 on the second one. What's the probability you're going to get that? What's the and here's the question then, really. If you roll 1 pair of dice 1 time, what is the probability you will roll 2 sixes? What is the probability you'll roll a 6 on the first dice and a 6 on the second one? So the question is really, let's see if I can get my pen thing going again. The question is really, what is the probability of rolling a 6 on the first dice and a 6 on the second dice? Well, what's the probability of rolling a 6 on the first dice? 1 out of 6, unless you have some bad dice. What's the probability of rolling a 6 on the second dice? 1 out of 6. What's the total probability? I want to get a 6 on the first dice and at the same time a 6 on this dice. 1/6 times 1/6 equals, do the math correctly, 1/36. I have a pretty low shot of getting Yahtzee. I have a low probability of getting a 6 on both die. It's possible, 1 out of 36 times. Maybe I'll do it. Let me roll them here and I'll tell you what I get. Oh, no, I did not get any 6s. Okay, so we can use this rule of multiplication to help us in genetics problems. Let's try a couple. We have to go back to Dan and Cindy. Remember, I said I'd come back to them. Dan and Cindy, remember, are this couple who had a child with cystic fibrosis. Their 3rd child, a son, was born with cystic fibrosis, and they couldn't quite figure out how this was inherited, and then they found out that their first daughter also has cystic fibrosis. I don't know where my cursor went, and it seems to have disappeared entirely. Oh, it's now just a little dot. Okay. The doctors say, Dan, Cindy, this is a genetically inherited disease, and it's called a single gene disease. You have just one gene, or your son and your daughter who have cystic fibrosis have a mistake going on in one of their genes. So it's a single gene that's kind of messed up or mutated, right? And this trait is recessive. So your son and daughter who have cystic fibrosis had to inherit a recessive allele for this trait from Dan and a recessive allele from Cindy. These individuals, the daughter and the son, have to have two recessive alleles to show the disease. And Dan and Cindy are like, but wait a minute, we don't have the disease. How can that be? And the doctor, kind of walked them through the whole business. They said, look, let's call a big C the allele that's kind of the normal allele that produces a healthy, turns out it's a healthy protein that's a transport protein. The little c we can call the cystic fibrosis allele if we want to call it that, okay? Dan and Cindy are both carrier, they're healthy. So they must have at least one copy of the normal allele. The normal allele is dominant, but they have to be healthy. They're healthy. So they have to have one version or one copy of the normal allele. But they also have a child and a daughter who have inherited two recessive alleles and have the disease. Where did that come from? Both Dan and Cindy are carriers of the recessive allele. Dan and Cindy then donate, each of them donates a little c to their daughter, and she gets two recessive Cs, or these two cystic fibrosis alleles, and she has the disease. We would say that Dan and Cindy are heterozygous, or carriers of the cystic fibrosis allele. So Dan and Cindy are like, I wonder if we have another child, what's the probability that we'd have a child with cystic fibrosis? And by the way, they did have another child, a little girl who is healthy. But let's think about that. And that's where we are, actually. Cystic fibrosis is inherited as an autosomal recessive disorder. Autosomal means it's not sex-linked. We'll talk about sex linkage in Chapter 15. Dan and Cindy are carriers for cystic fibrosis. They're heterozygous for the allele. So they're big C, little c. Okay? If these parents have a child, what is the probability that this child will have cystic fibrosis? Let me just see here. Okay? If these parents have a child, what is the probability the child will have cystic fibrosis? So here's the question, really, right? So here's my parents. They're heterozygous. The question is, what's the probability that they have a child with cystic fibrosis? What's the probability of getting the little c from mom and the little c from dad, right? What's the probability of getting a little c from mom, or from this first parent? Well, you either get the big C or the little c. There's a 50% chance that you're going to get the little c from mom, and there's a 50% chance you're going to get the little c from dad. But you need both of them to have the disease. You need to get one little c and that's the word we like, another little c. So we need to multiply the separate probabilities together. What's the probability of getting little c from these parents? 1/2 times 1/2, or 1/4. This is a pretty simple problem. We could have done a real quick Punnett square, and I'm going to do that right now. If this couple mates, the probability, we can figure out the probabilities of the expected probabilities of the next generation by doing a Punnett square. So each parent can either donate, remember the gametes go up here, each parent can either donate a big C or a little c. A big C or a little c, right? And we can fill in the Punnett. This is a Punnett that you should actually memorize because we use it all the time. It's a monohybrid cross. We can fill in the Punnett, and we realize that 1 out of 4 boxes represent our individual who has cystic fibrosis, 1/4. Yay! But we solved we solved this problem with rules of probability also. How about this problem? If this couple has 2 more children, what is the probability that both of the children will have cystic fibrosis? This one's a little harder. So the question, I usually try to write out the question. What's the probability that the first child has cystic fibrosis? That means inherits little c. That's the only way you can get cystic fibrosis. And the second child, right, has cystic fibrosis. Hey, that's an and problem. That's a multiplication problem. What's the probability that the first child gets cystic fibrosis? What's the probability the second child gets cystic fibrosis? 1/4. What's the probability if they have 2 children? What's the probability that the first and the second child have cystic fibrosis? 1/4 times 1/4, or 1 out of 16. When we say, what's the probability that the child has cystic fibrosis, that means that they're not just carriers. They actually show the disease. They phenotypically have cystic fibrosis, okay? That language is a little sneaky. But we just did this problem using the multiplication rule. We can use this multiplication rule all over the place. We'll see it again and again. The second rule that we're going to use is the addition rule of probability. Here's our definition. The probability of the occurrence of one of several mutually exclusive events occurring, either this or that, is equal to the sum of their separate probabilities. Okay, so now I'm playing Yahtzee again, and I'm trying to get a large straight. Maybe you don't know anything about Yahtzee, but you should. Maybe you'll have time to play Yahtzee at home with your 5th grade sister. Anyway, I'm playing Yahtzee, and I want to get a large straight. That's a run of 5 numbers in a row, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I have 2, 3, 4, and 5 already gotten on my dice, okay? I have 1 more roll, and I have 1 die to roll. I want to get a 1 or a 6 to get my large straight. What is the probability if I roll this thing 1 time that I get a 1 or a 6? So that's the question. If I roll 1 die, what is the probability I will roll either a 1 or, either a 1 or a 6? When you hear the word or, you realize that this is an addition rule. Okay, we've got 2 mutually exclusive events occurring. What's the probability of them occurring? You add the separate probabilities together. So what's the probability of rolling a 1? 1/6. What's the probability of rolling a 6? 1/6. What's the probability of rolling a 1 or a 6? 1/6 plus 1/6 equals, how do you do the math? Right? Don't mess up. 2/6 equals 1/3. Okay? Now, let's do this with genetics problems. Okay, we'll go back to Dan and Cindy because we know them. I feel like we know them. If Dan and Cindy, who are both heterozygous for the cystic fibrosis allele, okay, we already want to start thinking, how am I going to write that down? Okay, so Dan, there's Cindy. Okay, this is our mated couple, right? What is the probability that the child will be disease-free? Means she will not have cystic fibrosis. What kind of genotypes can you be to be disease-free? I think you could inherit the 2 big C's, or you could inherit a big C and a little c, right? You could be a carrier. So if I know the probability of inheriting 2 dominant alleles, and I know the probability of inheriting the heterozygous condition, I can simply add their probabilities together to get the total probability. All right. To do this, you probably just want to whip up a Punnett square. You won't even have to. You'll be using this rule in your head without even trying to. But here's our parents, Dan and Cindy's genotypes. We've made the Punnett square, and we can ask, what's the probability of getting big C, big C? Well, the probability of getting big C is 1 out of 4, right? Or what's the probability of getting big C, little c? Well, that's 2 out of 4, or 1/2. Should I write 2 out of 4? Sure. So what's the probability of having a child that is disease-free? 3 out of 4, 3/4. We could have just looked at the Punnett square for this, but the math does get harder, and I just wanted to show you a simple problem. There's the word I'm looking for. Let's read the second question, or question number 3, I should say. If Dan and Cindy, who are both heterozygous for the cystic fibrosis allele, have 2 more children, what is the probability that at least one of these children has cystic fibrosis? This one's really hard, or it's really simple, depending on how you solve the problem. We're going to solve it the hard way first, and then we'll flip it on its head. When I see this problem, I immediately start thinking, how many ways can we have this situation? So they have 2 children. What is the probability that at least one of these children has cystic fibrosis? So it looks like that language includes a situation in which they both have cystic fibrosis. You could have a situation in which your first child has cystic fibrosis, but your second doesn't. Or you could have a situation in which your first child is healthy, but then your second child has the disease. There are different ways to solve this. There are different ways to get this situation. We have to take that into account when we're solving this problem. And so on the next couple of slides, I wrote out essentially this question in probability format, and you'll see if it makes sense. Okay, remember we're dealing with Dan and Cindy, who are heterozygotes for cystic fibrosis. And we ask, hey, if they have 2 children, what's the probability that at least one of them has cystic fibrosis? I think to myself, there are 3 different ways to get this situation to happen. First, the first child could have cystic fibrosis and the second child be healthy. Or the first child could be healthy and the second child could have cystic fibrosis. Or the first child and the second child could have cystic fibrosis. I think we need to solve this problem. We need to figure out the probability of each part. And then, do you see the ands and the ors? Those are the clues for thinking about, do we add or do we multiply the separate probabilities? So first, what's the probability of getting this combination? Having the first child with cystic fibrosis and the second child healthy. Well, what's the probability of having cystic fibrosis? You can look back at your cross, but it's 1/4. What's the probability of being healthy? Well, 3/4. What's the probability, if you have 2 children, that the first child has cystic fibrosis and the second is healthy? 3/16. You multiply those probabilities because you need both of them to happen at the same time. That's an and or multiplication problem, right? So to get your first child with cystic fibrosis, the probability of having a first child with cystic fibrosis and the second child healthy is 3/16. Or what do we do with an or? We're going to add here. Or you could have the first child healthy and the second child with cystic fibrosis. So let's see, what's the probability of having the first child healthy? 3 out of 4. What's the probability of the second child getting cystic fibrosis? 1 out of 4. What's the probability that if you have 2 children, the first is healthy and the second has cystic fibrosis? Well, it's 3/16 again. So that's another combination, another way you could get this situation to happen. Or there's one more possibility. You could have 2 children that have cystic fibrosis, the way that the question was worded. Your first child could have cystic fibrosis and your second child could have cystic fibrosis. Well, what's the probability that the first child has cystic fibrosis? What's the probability that the second child inherits cystic fibrosis? What's the probability that your first child and your second child inherit cystic fibrosis? 1/16. So if this couple has 2 children, what is the probability that at least one of their children gets cystic fibrosis? It looks like it's 3/16 plus 3/16 plus 1/16, 7/16, right? Pretty high possibility. You could have flipped this question on its head and made your life very simple. Let's flip it on its head a minute. Let's go back to that question. If Dan and Cindy have 2 more children, what is the probability that at least one of these children has cystic fibrosis? Could we have possibly said, this is like the opposite of what is the probability that none of the children have cystic fibrosis? Right? If we can calculate the probability that none of the children inherit cystic fibrosis, then we should be able to figure out the total probability that at least one of them has cystic fibrosis, because probability always adds up to 1. And we can just say 1 minus the probability that no one gets cystic fibrosis. I think we can solve that. So our problem could be, well, this is like saying 1 minus the probability that the first child doesn't inherit cystic fibrosis, so is healthy. I'm just going to put a healthy there, an H. And the second child is healthy. Well, what's the probability that the first child is healthy? We can go back to our Punnett square, but 3 out of 4 of the children should be healthy. What's the probability that the second child is healthy? Well, 3 out of 4. What's the probability that both children are healthy? Well, 9 out of 16. What's the probability that if you have 2 children, at least one of them inherits the disease? 1 minus 9/16 equals 7/16. I kind of snuck, that was a sneaky situation. The kicker is when you're looking at problems, like this problem down here, number 3, this problem did not tell us which order the children were born in. There were more than one possibility for order. So we have to take into account all the different possible ways that this could happen. And that's why we had to take into account, well, what if the first child has cystic fibrosis and the second child is healthy? Or what if the first child is healthy and the second child has cystic fibrosis? The problem didn't ask us for a specific sequence. It said, hey, what's the probability of this happening? I don't care how it happens, but what's the probability? Okay? So order was not important in this question. Sometimes the order is written in the question, so we have to read the questions carefully. Oh, here's a fun challenge problem. Oh, you're going to love this one. You're going to love it. Okay, remember Dan and Cindy's pedigree. So first daughter has cystic fibrosis, and then third child has cystic fibrosis. This guy right here is healthy. I want to know, what's the probability that he is a carrier for cystic fibrosis? So you're like, okay, so let's do a little Punnett again. We're going to make a monohybrid cross real quick, right? Big C, little c, big C, little c. I'm getting used to this one. I should remember it without even writing it down, right? Oh. So looking at this problem, what is the probability that Dan and Cindy's first son, who is healthy, is a carrier of cystic fibrosis? How many of you think 50% or 1/2? Every once in a while, somebody in the class says, no, it's not 1/2. It seems like an easy problem. It seems like it should be 1/2 because look at the Punnett. There are 2 out of 4 boxes that represent a heterozygote. But guess what? What do we know about this son? What do we know he isn't? What do we know his genotype is not? His genotype is not little c, little c. So we know his genotype is one of these two. It's either big C, or big C, little c. What's the probability of getting big C, little c now that we know it's not little c, little c? What's the probability? 2 out of 3. 2/3 is the answer to that question. Oops, I wrote that wrong. 2/3. That's a challenge question. Okay, moving on. We're going to skip problem 4, although this problem might be really good for practice. You can solve it on your own, talk to friends or talk to me and see if you get the right answer, etc. We're going to move on to problem 5. This is our last problem. It's a challenge. Now we're going to look at 2 traits at once and use rules of probability to solve these problems. So suppose we're looking back at the peas. The peas, remember, have, we looked at seed color and seed shape, and we've got 2 individuals that we're mating. We know their genotypes. There they are. Big Y, big R, little r, crossed with little y, big R, little r. This isn't the dihybrid cross we looked at before. It's different, and it's different because, I see that's different. So, we're going to ask the question, if these 2 individuals mate, what is the probability that an offspring from this cross will have the genotype big Y, little r, little r? Are we going to need to make a big Punnett square to look at and try to solve this problem and look for individuals on the Punnett square that have the genotype big Y, little r, little r? Let's look at this problem on a blank slide so that we can try to solve it. So here's the problem. There are parents on the top. These are our parent generation, right? Big Y, big R, little r, crossed with little y, big R, little r. And we want to get this. Big Y, little r, little r. How are we going to do this? You can make a Punnett square with 2 genes. It could be a pretty big Punnett square. And if you make a Punnett square, you have to make the gametes correctly. Remember, when you're making a Punnett square, let's say you're making a Punnett square and you put the gametes out here on the edges. Every gamete that you make has got to have 1 Y and 1 R in it. You got to have a gene for color and a gene for shape. You can't just have a gene for color. You can't just have a gene for shape. You can't have 2 genes for color. You can't have 2 genes for shape. Got to have 1 of each. If you make that correctly, you should be able to sort out your Punnett, okay? I'm not going to do that. You could try to do that, so you can pause the video and try to solve this problem. Or you can use rules of probability in a pretty simple method in which you can think about this problem as being a 2-gene situation. So for these parents, we want to find the probability that these parents donate big Y, little y for the color gene, and that means multiply, and little r for the shape gene, right? What if I solve this problem by looking at the 2 genes separately and simply multiply the separate probabilities together? That'll make the problem pretty easy. I can look at the Y genes and then at the R genes, and I can solve the problem by multiplying the separate probabilities together. So I'm going to do the Y gene problem first. I'm going to say, I've got parents that are big Y, little y, crossed with little y, and I'm going to look at a Punnett of the types of offspring these parents can make. Parent 1 over here can either donate a big Y or a little y. Parent 2 can only donate a little y. So it looks like 50% of the offspring will get big Y, little y, and 50% will get little y. So if I look at the Y gene first, there is a 50% chance that my offspring will inherit big Y, little y. So I'm going to put 1/2 for the Y gene. Now I just have to solve for the R gene, and I can multiply the separate probabilities together to get the total probability. The R gene, hey, this R gene is something I already recognize. It's a monohybrid cross. I should have this one memorized, but I might as well whip it out. Okay, you can do this too in your own free time. Yeah. Do you guys have a lot more free time now that you're at home, or are your parents making you work hard? Okay, what's the probability of getting little r from these R parents? Well, it's 1/4. What's the probability of getting big Y, little y, and at the same time, little r? 1/8, sorry. 1/8 should be the answer. We did it without having to do a big Punnett square. That makes me very happy. You could even have done this without even drawing 2 little Punnett squares if you just wanted to use the rules of probability. I even like that better. But this is a kind of handy way to do it. Let's look at the next problem. Oh, this is the same kind of problem. We just have to do, we're looking for a different solution here, right? What is the probability that an offspring from this cross will have the genotype little y, big R, little r? Now, okay, so here's the question. Guy, what is the, I think this is going to be easy. What is the probability of getting little y from these parents? And then what's the probability of getting big R, little r from these parents? And then we multiply the separate probabilities together. Poof, we get the answer, right? So what's the probability of getting 2 little y's from these y parents? Remember, our y parents here are big Y, little y crossed with little y, little y. We can look back. If you flip back a screen, you can see the Punnett. What's the probability of getting 2 little y's? 1/2. You can also just ask yourself, well, you have to get a little y from this parent. The probability of getting a little y from that parent is 1. The probability of getting a little y from this parent is 1/2. So the total probability of getting little y is 1/2. Now all we have to do is figure out the probability of getting big R, little r from these R parents. Again, this is our monohybrid cross, and we should be able to remember these. What's the thing we're trying to look for? The probability of being heterozygous? Yeah, 2 out of 4, or 1/2. What's the total probability of getting an offspring with the genotype little y, and big R, little r? 1/4. No. I love probability. It makes my life simple. Okay, is there anything else? No, that's the end of Chapter 14, Part 2. There are lots of review problems in Chapter 14 at the end of the chapter in our book, and there are answers in the back of the book. I think that must be true of the online version also, but I'm not 100% sure. So, I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to discard the annotations. And then we will close up shop for today, and I'll talk to you in Part 3 later.